All right, so we're diving into a pretty complex topic today surrounding the 2034 World Cup. Seems like there's a ton to talk about. You've sent over a really interesting mix of sources. We've got articles that lay out the whole decision, some super passionate Reddit threads, and even human rights reports. It's clear there's a lot to unpack here with Saudi Arabia getting awarded the tournament, and we're going to do our best to make sense of all of it.
Yeah, definitely a decision that's sparking a lot of debate, and for good reason. There are some serious concerns about why FIFA made this choice and what it means for holding the World Cup in a country with a human rights record like Saudi Arabia's.
So, just so everyone's on the same page, Saudi Arabia is officially going to host the 2034 World Cup. What's kind of strange is that they actually won the bid without anyone else even trying to compete with them.
That's right, and it seems to be part of a bigger trend we're seeing with FIFA. They're going with some pretty unusual hosting setups. Just look at the 2030 World Cup. It's going to be hosted across 3 continents: Spain, Portugal, and Morocco. It's definitely a big change from how they used to do it with just one country hosting.
You mentioned some worries about why FIFA picks Saudi Arabia for 2034. A lot of the articles and Reddit discussions you sent over seem to suggest that FIFA is putting money ahead of things like human rights and the history of football.
Yeah, a lot of fans and people commenting online feel like this decision all comes down to money. There's a lot of distrust and cynicism about whether FIFA is willing to look past serious problems if it means they can make a lot of money.
Some of those Reddit comments you pointed out are pretty harsh. One person even said they think the mascot will be a smiling waterboard. It seems like folks are having a real tough time balancing their love for soccer with their worries about where it's being hosted.
It's a tough spot to be in, for sure. And it reflects a bigger issue we see in sports these days, the clash between entertainment and ethics. It really makes you think, can we as fans enjoy these huge events without feeling like we're somehow supporting unethical practices?
And it's not just online chatter either. You flagged some reports from human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International that are seriously concerning. These reports talk about a potential unimaginable human cost if the World Cup is held in Saudi Arabia.
Those concerns are based on real evidence, especially when it comes to how migrant workers are treated. For example, Human Rights Watch put out a report called "Die First and I'll Pay You Later." That title alone.
Yeah.
Yeah, it focuses on how likely it is that migrant workers in Saudi Arabia could face tons of abuse and exploitation.
It's a chilling reminder of what happened with the Qatar World Cup. All those reports of workers dying and being forced to work in terrible conditions.
Sadly, yeah, it's a similar situation. And when you consider just how much construction is happening in Saudi Arabia, it's super worrying to think about what could happen with building all the World Cup stuff. To give you an idea of the scale here, they say over 21,000 workers have already died while building NEOM, which is this huge development project in Saudi Arabia.
Wow, that's a crazy number. Of course, Saudi officials are saying that's not true and that hosting the World Cup will actually make things better for human rights. They even say it could help move things forward faster for women's rights and freedom in the country.
Right, this is where the whole idea of sports washing comes in. It's basically using big sporting events to make a country look better around the world and distract from all the negative stuff about how they're run and their human rights record.
So, kind of like a big PR campaign to try and make people forget about the bad stuff.
Exactly. And you know what? It can work really well. Think about it. When you picture the Olympics or the World Cup, do you automatically think about human rights abuses in that country? Or do you think about how exciting the games are, amazing athletes doing incredible things, that feeling of the whole world coming together?
I gotta admit, usually I think about the sport first.
Yeah, and that's exactly what countries doing this sports washing are hoping for. They want to use those good feelings to change how the world sees them, even if it means people don't pay attention to the serious problems.
But that's where things get tricky, right? Because if it works, if a country uses sports washing and everyone starts to like them more, doesn't that mean they basically got away with it? They hid their bad human rights record without actually changing anything.
That's the big ethical problem here. And it's why we need to look closely at what happened in Qatar. Did their human rights record actually improve after they had the World Cup? Or was it all just a temporary show?
You know, when we were talking about how much money Saudi Arabia might make from this, it made me wonder about FIFA. What about their finances? They are a business in the end, aren't they? Giving the World Cup to whoever pays the most has got to be good for business, right?
Well, it's important to keep in mind that FIFA is officially a nonprofit,
Hmm.
but they do operate on a huge scale with billions of dollars going through their accounts. There's no doubt that those hosting rights for the World Cup are a major way for them to make money.
So, if they're not focused on making profits the way a regular company would be, why are they making these decisions that are causing so much controversy? Do they just want to make soccer more popular around the world? Or is something else going on? Something maybe not so great?
It's probably a mix of things. On one hand, I do think they want to grow the sport and bring the World Cup to new places.
Yeah.
But there's also the issue of power and influence. Giving a country the World Cup can be a way to get on their good side, make political deals, and strengthen relationships.
So, like a diplomatic tool.
Kind of, yeah. And that just adds another layer to this whole sports washing discussion. Because it's not just a country trying to clean up their image, it's also about all the complicated global politics and how these sports events can be used to push those agendas forward.
So, it sounds like FIFA is stuck in a tough spot. If they care about human rights and doing the right thing, they risk making powerful countries mad and losing out on big money from hosting deals. But if they put money and politics first, everyone criticizes them and says they're part of the human rights abuses.
It's a difficult situation for sure, and it shows why FIFA needs to be more transparent and accountable.
But honestly, isn't it kind of naive to think that FIFA can solve these huge world problems all on their own? Even if they had stricter rules for which countries could host, wouldn't countries with bad human rights records just find ways to cheat or hide what they're doing?
That's a really good point. And it brings us back to what we as fans can do and the choices we make.
So are you saying the only way to do something is to boycott the 2034 World Cup? Or are there other things we can do to put pressure on FIFA and Saudi Arabia to improve their human rights record?
A boycott is one option, but it's not the only one. And to be honest, it's not even clear if boycotts really work. Remember, even with all the problems with Qatar, tons of people still watch the 2022 World Cup.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine millions of people around the world all deciding not to watch such a huge event. So what else can we do? How can we as fans make our voices heard and push for real change without giving up on the sport we love?
Well, the first thing is we have to stay informed. We need to go beyond just the headlines and really understand the issues. Read those human rights reports, learn about the specific problems, and don't let the excitement of the games make you forget about what might be going on behind the scenes.
So it's like we need to be more critical when we watch these events, not just accept everything we see as okay.
Exactly. And we need to use whatever platform we have, even if it's small, to raise awareness. Talk to your friends, share your concerns online, write to your politicians. The more people who know about these problems, the more pressure we can put on FIFA and these countries to take human rights seriously.
So it's about starting a bigger conversation and using our voices together to push for a World Cup that's run ethically. But what about supporting organizations that are already working in places like Saudi Arabia to protect human rights? Could that be a better way to actually make a difference?
Definitely. There are a lot of organizations working hard to make things better in that region. They often rely on donations and help from people all over the world. By supporting them, we can directly help the people who are most at risk and push for positive changes from within those countries.
That makes sense. So it's not just about whether we watch the games or not. It's about actively supporting the people fighting for fairness and equality. It's about using our money and our voices to make a real difference beyond just the world of sports.
Exactly. And that actually leads perfectly into what I wanted to talk about next, this whole idea of sports washing. We really need to break down how it works, why countries like Saudi Arabia are so into it, and what the consequences could be both for them and for soccer as a whole.
Yeah, let's get into that. I think it's important for everyone to really understand this concept.
Okay, so let's unpack how sports washing actually works in practice. The basic idea is to link a country's image to all those good feelings that come with a big sporting event like the World Cup. The excitement, the global attention, the national pride, all of that gets connected to the host country, even if they have a bad track record on stuff like human rights.
Right, so it's almost like they're using a big happy event to cover up the not so happy stuff going on.
Yeah, exactly. And it can be surprisingly effective, too. Think about it when you imagine the Olympics or the World Cup. What comes to mind first? Do you automatically think about human rights abuses happening in that country? Or do you picture the thrill of the competition, amazing athletic feats, and that sense of the whole world coming together?
Honestly, yeah, my first thoughts usually go to the sport itself.
That's exactly what countries engaging in sports washing are counting on. They want to use those positive associations to basically rebrand themselves on the world stage, even if it means hiding some pretty serious issues.
But that's where the whole thing gets kind of messed up, right? Because if it works, if a country manages to use sports washing to make people like them more, Haven't they kind of gotten away with something? They've basically swept their human rights record under the rug without actually changing anything.
That's the heart of the ethical problem here.
Yeah.
And it's why we need to look at examples like Qatar and really analyze them. Did hosting the World Cup actually lead to any real improvement in their human rights practices? Or was it all just a temporary facade, a way to look good for a little while?
Earlier when we were talking about the potential financial benefits for Saudi Arabia, it got me thinking about FIFA's side of things. What's the economic impact on them? I mean, they're a business at the end of the day, right?
Mhm.
So giving the World Cup to the highest bidder makes good business sense, doesn't it?
It is important to remember that FIFA is officially a nonprofit organization. However, they do operate on a massive scale, with billions of dollars going through their accounts. So there's no question that hosting rights for the World Cup are a huge source of revenue for them.
So if they're not exactly motivated by profits in the same way a regular company is, what's driving them to make these controversial decisions? Is it simply about making soccer more popular around the world? Or could there be something more to it, something maybe not so idealistic?
I'd say it's probably a combination of factors. There's definitely a genuine desire to grow the sport and bring the World Cup to new parts of the world. But we also can't ignore the element of power and influence. Awarding the World Cup to a country can be seen as a way to gain favor, forge political alliances, and strengthen relationships.
So it becomes a kind of diplomatic tool.
In a way, yes. And that just adds another layer of complexity to this whole sports washing thing. Because it's not just a country trying to improve its image on a global scale. It's also about the intricate web of international politics and how these sporting events can be used to advance certain agendas.
It sounds like FIFA might be in a bit of a tricky situation. If they prioritize human rights and ethical considerations, they risk alienating powerful countries and potentially losing out on lucrative hosting deals. But on the other hand, if they focus on the money and political alliances, they open themselves up to a ton of criticism and accusations of being complicit in human rights abuses.
It's definitely a tightrope walk for them. And it highlights why there needs to be more transparency and accountability within FIFA itself.
But realistically, can we expect FIFA to single-handedly solve these massive global issues? Even if they put stricter requirements in place for potential host countries, wouldn't countries with poor human rights records just find ways to get around those rules or hide their abuses?
That's a really valid point. It brings us back to the role of fans and the choices we make as individuals.
So are you suggesting that boycotting the 2034 World Cup is the only way to make a real difference? Are there any other actions we can take to put pressure on FIFA and Saudi Arabia to address their human rights record?
A boycott is certainly one option on the table, but it's not the only one. And to be honest, the effectiveness of boycotts is debatable. Remember, even with all the controversy surrounding Qatar, the 2022 World Cup had incredibly high viewership.
It is hard to imagine millions of people around the world all agreeing to tune out such a major event. So what are some alternatives? How can we as fans make our voices heard and push for positive change without having to completely abandon the sport we love?
Well, the first and most important thing is staying informed. We need to dig deeper than just the headlines and really try to understand the complexities of these issues. Read those human rights reports, learn about the specific concerns people have, and don't let the excitement of the matches overshadow the potential problems.
So it's kind of like we need to develop a more critical eye, right? We can't just blindly accept everything we see at face value.
Exactly. And we need to use whatever platforms we have, no matter how small, to raise awareness. Talk to your friends, share your concerns online, even write to your elected officials. The more people who are informed about these issues, the more pressure we can put on FIFA and these countries to take human rights seriously.
So it's about starting a broader conversation and using our collective voice to advocate for a more ethical and responsible approach to the World Cup. What about supporting organizations that are already working on the ground to protect human rights in places like Saudi Arabia? Could that be a more effective way to make a tangible difference?
Absolutely. There are so many organizations doing incredible work to promote human rights in that region, and they often rely heavily on donations and support from people all over the world. By contributing to their efforts, we can directly help those who are most vulnerable and advocate for positive changes from within.
That makes a lot of sense. So it's not just about what we choose to watch or not watch. It's about actively supporting the people who are on the front lines, fighting for justice and equality. It's about using our resources and our voices to make a difference that extends beyond just the world of sports. So it sounds like we're talking about a multifaceted approach here, staying informed, raising awareness, supporting human rights organizations, all while wrestling with this personal decision of whether to even engage with the World Cup itself. I keep circling back to this question. Can a World Cup even be hosted ethically at this point, given FIFA's history and how massive these events are?
That's the big question, isn't it? Honestly, I don't think there's a simple yes or no answer. Maybe instead of asking if a perfectly ethical World Cup is even possible, we should be asking, how can we make it as ethical as we can? What concrete steps could FIFA and these host countries take to minimize the potential for harm and really maximize the good that could come out of it?
I like that reframing. It's a good way to think about it. So let's do some brainstorming. If we were in charge of making this ethical World Cup blueprint, what would be at the top of our list?
First and foremost, FIFA can't just talk about human rights. They actually have to prioritize them. It can't just be a few lines in some bidding document. It has to be real action. They need to have clear standards that host countries have to meet, with real consequences if they don't.
So no more looking the other way when they see a medium risk of human rights violations like they did with Qatar.
Exactly. And those standards need to cover a wide range of issues, not just how migrant workers are treated. We're talking freedom of speech, protection for LGBTQ plus people, women's rights, everything.
That sounds incredibly ambitious, especially when you consider all the cultural differences and political stuff involved. But let's say FIFA actually does come up with these strong standards. How do we make sure countries actually follow them?
That's where independent monitoring and enforcement come in. FIFA needs to work with trustworthy international groups to really assess how host countries are doing on human rights, both before and during the tournament. And they have to be willing to punish those countries if they break the rules, even if that means taking away their hosting rights.
That would be a huge change in how things work. Right now, it feels like FIFA has all the power. They pick the host, set the rules, and they're the ones who decide what happens if those rules are broken.
Yeah, you're right. That imbalance of power is a big problem if we want a truly ethical World Cup. There needs to be a more even distribution of power where host countries, human rights groups, and even fans have more of a say in how things are done.
So maybe a system where awarding the World Cup isn't just about who offers the most money or the flashiest presentation, but it also takes into account a country's track record on human rights and whether they're willing to work with independent groups to make sure things are done right.
Exactly. And it can't just be about checking boxes and doing the bare minimum either. There needs to be a real change in the culture at FIFA and in the whole world of football, where human rights are built into everything they do, not just an afterthought or something they try to fix with PR when things go wrong.
That's a lofty goal, but I think it's one worth fighting for. And it makes me think about what our responsibility is as fans in all of this. Is it enough to just know about these problems, or do we need to be doing more?
Knowing is important, but it's just the first step. We have to speak up and make choices that demand better from FIFA, from host countries, and from everyone involved in football. We can support those human rights organizations, push for better standards and ways to enforce them, and be careful about which events we choose to support with our viewership and our money.
It's realizing that we're not just watching the game, we're part of shaping what it becomes.
Absolutely. And remember, things don't usually change overnight. It takes continuous effort, working together, and being willing to challenge how things are done. But I believe if enough people speak up and demand a World Cup that is ethical, we can force real change, not just in football, but in the world.
That's a hopeful thought. It's a good reminder that even with all these problems and controversies, the World Cup can still inspire us, bring people together, and remind us of what connects us as humans.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we look towards 2034 and beyond, let's challenge ourselves to make that hope a reality. Let's work towards a World Cup that celebrates not just great athletes, but also justice, equality, and the dignity of all people.
I love that. And on that note, we'll leave you with one last thought. What kind of legacy do we want the World Cup to have? What kind of world do we want to build through the power of sports? The answer, as always, is up to each of us.